Thank you, Jean-Luc. Good job. In the blink of an eye, Kaylee Mills was gone. She'd just left home with her friends to go to a Halloween party. She was riding in the back seat, and they were only traveling a mile away from home to a friend's house. They were only a few blocks away when the car she was riding in veered off the road. Kaylee was ejected from the back seat of the car and died instantly. Her 3 friends walked away with only minor cuts and bruises. Kaylee was the only one in the car not wearing a seatbelt. And she isn't alone. According to the Center for Disease Control, in the last decade, 40,000 unbelted drivers have been killed in accidents where seatbelts would have saved them. Hundreds of thousands of people drive unbuckled every day because they have no legal incentive to buckle up. This is why Jeffrey and I believe transportation policy must be changed. But before we look at specifically how we're going to do that, I want to direct your attention to the criterion for today's debate round, which you can tag as net benefits. Again, the criterion, or how we're asking you to judge this round, is through the weighing mechanism of net benefits. And that's pretty simple. It just means that the advantages of the case outweigh the disadvantages. If Jeffrey and I can show that the benefits of our case outweigh the costs, we believe we warrant your ballot. Conversely, if the negative team can prove that our plan costs lives or doesn't save them at all, they've warranted your ballot. But before we specifically show how we do uphold our burden, I want to address what's happening right now in the status quo. Background point 1 is 32 states without primary seatbelt law. Right now, we have 32 states without primary seatbelt law. According to the Center for Disease Control in January of 2014, quote, laws requiring seatbelt use are either primary or secondary enforcement laws. Primary enforcement laws allow police officers to pull over drivers and issue tickets, just because the drivers or their passengers aren't wearing seatbelts. Secondary enforcement laws only allow police officers to issue tickets for seatbelt violations if drivers have been pulled over for some other offense. Secondary enforcement significantly limits the ability of officers to enforce seatbelt laws. Rates of seatbelt use are 9 percentage points higher in primary enforcement states than secondary states, end quote. The Governor's Highway Safety Association adds to this by saying, quote, 18 states include rear seats as primary enforcement, end quote. So that was a lot of different terms and states and numbers, but I want to break down what it means in the impact. The impact is that proper enforcement is lacking. Proper enforcement lacking. Basically what the evidence states is that in 32 out of 50 states, the law is incomplete. In many of those 32 states, passengers in the back seat don't have to wear their seatbelt. And in some states, no one has to wear their seatbelt. This current legislation has resulted in a grievous harm to our great nation, and that harm is human life lost. Our one and only harm is human life lost. From the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration in February of last year, quote, in 2015, there were 22,441 occupants of passenger vehicles killed in motor vehicle traffic crashes. 48%, or roughly 11,000, were unrestrained at the time of the crash, end quote. Here's the impact. Thousands of needless deaths. The impact of not having primary seatbelt law is thousands of needless deaths. Right now, people don't wear seatbelts in the majority of cases because there's not a reason to. Not wearing a seatbelt has no legal repercussions in the majority of states, and this is resulting in thousands of deaths every single year. This is the problem caused by the status quo. And now's the time for a simple but impactful solution. That comes in the form of our plan. Our plan has one mandate, and it reads as follows. The USFG, United States Federal Government, will institute a program to provide states with an incentive to establish full primary seatbelt law. They will do this by withholding highway trust funds from any state which has not implemented full primary law. Specifically, the government will withhold 2% of highway trust funds from any state without full primary law beginning in fiscal year 2020. The government will increase the amount of funds withheld by an additional 2% each subsequent year until it has reached an 8% cap on funds withheld. Now we just have regular agency and enforcement of Congress and the President. This starts fiscal year 2020, so our plan will begin to take action October 1st of 2019. And because this is a condition on a grant, the Highway Trust Fund, that already exists, no additional funding is going to be required. But I want to get into the important stuff. How does our plan work? It does so in 3 ways, and those are our 3 solvency points. Solvency point 1 is history proves our plan will work. History proves our plan will work. This comes from an academic group of researchers writing for Texas A&M University in 2006. They talk about a plan that was passed that's very similar to ours. Here's what they say. Quote, in October of 2000, President Clinton signed federal legislation requiring states to set .08 BAC as the legal limit while driving. States were given until October 1st, 2003 to pass .08 BAC legislation or lose 2% of their federal highway construction funds. Each subsequent year of noncompliance carried an additional 2% reduction in highway funds, culminating in an 8% reduction in funds by 2007. Sounds pretty familiar. The evidence concludes by saying this. The introduction of incentives tied to federal highway construction funds resulted in all 50 states passing .08 BAC laws by mid-2005, end quote. The impact of this argument is that the states follow a federal incentive. The states follow a federal incentive. History shows that when the federal government offers a monetary incentive to states to pass a policy, the states comply. In 2000, the exact same incentive that our policy uses was used with a 100% success rate. Our plan will do the same. Solvency Point 2 and 3 have to do with how our plan saves lives. Step 1 is Solvency Point 2, increased seatbelt use. In states that switch to primary law, they experience increased seatbelt use. From the CDC in December of 2015, quote, studies of 5 states that changed their belt use laws from secondary to primary enforcement found that belt use increased from 12 to 18 percentage points. The Center for Disease Control and Prevention's systematic review of 13 high-quality studies found that primary laws increased belt use by about 14 percentage points and reduced occupant fatalities by about 8% compared to secondary laws, end quote. And the impact of this argument is simple. It's just what the evidence says. Primary law increases use. Primary law increases use because when people realize there is a real-world consequence for driving without wearing a seatbelt, that's when more of them buckle up. And that's empirically proven. But this increased use leads to our third and final solvency point. Solvency 3, or the overall impact of our policy, is lives are saved. Solvency 3 is lives saved. According to the CDC in January of 2014, quote, most drivers and passengers killed in crashes are unrestrained. Seatbelts dramatically reduce risk of death and serious injury. Among drivers and front seat passengers, seatbelts reduce the risk of death by 45% and cut the risk of serious injury in half by 50%. Seatbelts save thousands of lives each year, and increasing use would save thousands more. Seatbelts saved almost 13,000 lives in 2009. And if all drivers and passengers had worn seatbelts that year, almost 4,000 more people would be alive today, end quote. Kaylee Mills, she didn't need to die. The 4,000 other people who died that same year like she did, they didn't need to die either. And we can fix it with a simple policy change. Because this plan saves lives and benefits society, Jeffrey and I ask for your support. Thank you for your time.
Hey Samuel, interesting speech. Can I actually see a copy of your 1EZ to start off? To start off with a general question, would you contend that we should always enforce our laws to the maximum extent possible?
I would say the maximum extent possible could be abused. A phrase like that, I don't know what you're attempting to do with that, so I'm not sure.
All right, so let's scale it back a bit then.
Okay.
Would you agree that, or would you contend rather, that we should enforce our laws strongly?
I think enforcement of existing laws is good. I'm not going to go overboard and say we should have crazy harsh penalties or anything like that.
What about policies like the Escaped Slave Act back in the 1800s? Should we have enforced that law strongly?
I would say that if a law is bad like that one, we shouldn't enforce it. I'll concede that the point of our case is to argue that our law is good, on the other hand.
Excellent, I figured that out. Okay. Let's move down.
I thought I could make it a little clearer, but thank you.
Let's move down to talk about the studies that you've conducted, and actually the states that actually have primary enforcement right now. So these states chose to have that primary enforcement, right?
That is correct.
All right. And all states have either no enforcement or secondary enforcement, and that comes from their choice, right?
Yes.
Okay, so the states that have secondary enforcement right now are the states that chose not to have primary enforcement.
Yes, that is correct.
So these states don't want primary enforcement. just to be clear.
They might not be states that don't want it. They could additionally be states that are apathetic. The simple fact that they haven't passed primary seatbelt law doesn't mean that they have adverse opposition to it.
Okay, interesting. So let's actually look down to your studies. With all of these studies, you mentioned one from the NHTSA and one from the CDC, which evaluated 13 other studies. Were all of those studies looking at states that have enacted primary enforcement laws?
That's how we get the historical precedent, is examining the rates of use in states that have already passed primary.
Let's talk about your mandate for a second. So
Okay.
you're incentivizing states by removing highway trust fund money. How much highway trust fund money is given to the states?
It varies state by state. We have a complete graph at the table if you'd like to take a look.
And my second question about this is, how does the amount of money that we're giving to the states right now compare to the amount of money we were giving them in 2000 and 2007, I believe, which is when the BAC laws were passed?
Sure, it's relatively equivalent. As inflation has increased, so is the amount of money in the highway
But we've
trust fund.
seen no evidence to support this yet, correct?
I can't bring up a piece of evidence in today's round that specifically says Rhode Island got $2 million in 2000 and gets $2,200,000 today, if that's what you're looking for.
So we don't know exactly how this amount of money compares to the amount of money we had previously.
It more has to do with the percentage than the physical dollar amount itself. You as a state are losing hundreds of thousands of dollars if you choose not to comply.
Okay, interesting. So let's look down to your solvency points lastly. Your solvency points talk about how use increased, and those were specifically in the states, just to be clear, those were specifically in the states that have primary enforcement laws right now.
Sure, use can increase in a secondary state, but it'll increase even more if that secondary state upgrades to primary.
All right, makes sense.
All right.
While accidents and fatalities that occur in our vehicles today may be tragic, the sad truth of the matter is that reforming the law that the affirmative team wants you to isn't actually going to accomplish anything. You see, primary seatbelt laws not only have been demonstrated to no longer actually increase seatbelt use or prevent fatalities, but the states aren't even going to respond to the incentives adequately. That said, let's begin by responding to the affirmative team's criterion of net benefits. Sure, net benefits is a good way of gauging the round, but we also have to take into account what are known as stop issues, simply meaning that the affirmative team must solve a problem, if they actually present it, must solve a significant problem, and they can't just be solving something that's outside of the resolution. Their only burden in a debate round is to uphold the resolution of reforming federal transportation policy. If they don't do that, they should lose the round. That said, let's get into a quick topicality point evaluating why the affirmative team falls outside of the resolution before we get into a couple of solvency points. Topicality point number one, you can write down as no transportation reform. No transportation reform. Now, of key importance here is that the resolution is asking the affirmative team to reform federal transportation policy. State policies have no relevance to the resolution. There's a couple of subpoints under this point. Subpoint A here is of the standard, which is simply of the resolution. We're using the resolution as the standard to determine what is topical and what is not topical. If the affirmative team falls within the resolution, they're fine. If they fall outside of it, then they should lose the round on this basis. That said, let's move on to subpoint B, which is of the interpretation. The interpretation. Specifically, the interpretation that is relevant to this debate round is that of reform. Specifically, reform, as defined by Oxford Dictionary, is to make changes in something in order to improve it. Let's look at how the affirmative team violates the definition and the resolution in my third subpoint, though, which is of the violations. The violations. This is why they are not reforming federal transportation policy. My first subpoint is of state reform. State reform. Let's keep in mind that all of the advantages from the affirmative team's plan are coming from a state reform, not a federal one. Now they're probably going to gut up here and say, sure, well maybe the seatbelt laws aren't topical, but what we're doing with holding federal highway funds, that is a federal transportation fund, or policy. There are two problems with this, and those are my next two violations. The first violation here is if that's the only standard, then everything is topical. Everything is topical. If the only standard for whether or not something is transportation policy is that we have to withhold highway funds from the states in order to incentivize them to do something, then we could incentivize literally anything. We could incentivize them to do something like ban abortion or something like that. It would mean that the resolution is suddenly meaningless because everything is resolutional. My second violation over here, though, is that they aren't actually reforming federal policy. Sure, highway funds might in some aspects affect transportation, but they're not actually reforming how those highway funds are allocated. There's no actual change here, which leads to the impact of no fiat power. No fiat power. Fiat power simply meaning that the affirmative team has no power to actually pass their plan, since they're outside of the resolution. That said, let's move on to some solvency points addressing their harms. You see, even if we do pass their plan, we solve absolutely nothing. Let's look to that first in Solvency 1, which is of no impact of primary enforcement laws. No impact of primary enforcement laws. There will be two subpoints examining two separate studies that have found this conclusion. The first is subpoint A, which is of no impact in 2017. No impact in 2017. Now, we'll go ahead and just say that maybe in the past, primary seatbelt laws did work to increase seatbelt use compliance. But in the current system, given changing variables in road safety, traffic safety, etc., they no longer have any effect. Let's look to that explicitly supported from Sam Harper, a PhD in epidemiology, as well as Aaron Strunk, who has a PhD in economics, writing for the American Journal of Preventative Medicine, March 20th, 2017, when they state that, quote, models adjusted only for crash characteristics and state-level covariate models showed a protective effect of primary enforcement. After adjustment for fixed state characteristics and secular trends, there was no evidence of an effect of upgrading from secondary to primary enforcement in the whole population for any age group. Conclusion, primary seatbelt laws do not increase seatbelt use, unquote. Subpoint B under here, though, is of comprehensive studies find no effect. Comprehensive studies find no effect. Now, the Center for Disease Control actually cites one of these studies on December 2nd of 2015, when it states that, quote, Traynor examined correlations between recent changes in teen driving regulations, DWI laws, seatbelt laws, and difference in traffic fatalities using 1999 to 2003 data from the 48 contiguous states. After controlling for numerous factors affecting crash fatality risk, such as weather conditions, law enforcement spending, and speed limits, he found that per-mile fatality rates did not decrease with increasing strictness of seatbelt laws, where our primary law for all occupants was most strict. In other words, when we actually take into account all the variables active on our transportation system, instead of just focusing our studies on a limited amount of variables in the current system, what we find is that seatbelt laws do not increase seatbelt use, even if they are enforced more strongly. That said, let's move on to solvency point number 2, which is of incentives have failed in the past. Incentives have failed in the past. Now, of course, Solvency 1 was dealing with, even if we did vote for the affirmative team and these laws were passed at a state level, they wouldn't work. But the question is not really even that, but more whether or not states would even pass these in the first place. Because in the past, they have refused to implement these primary seatbelt laws even when the government tried to incentivize them to do so. Let's look to the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, October 2009, when they write that in 2005, the government gave primary belt law incentive grants to the states. Even after the grants were implemented, 21 states refused to implement primary seatbelt laws and still need a primary enforcement seatbelt law today, unquote. Even if we vote for the affirmative team, they accomplish nothing because states have refused to respond to these specific incentives in the past. Let's look at specifically subpoint B under here, or subpoint A, I guess you can write down as seatbelt incentives specifically failed. Seatbelt incentives specifically failed. But the second main problem here is that these states didn't just need incentives. They needed to use a whole bunch of strategies before they could actually effect reform. This is subpoint B, which is of needed 7 strategies to actually implement. Needed 7 strategies to actually implement. Even the states that wanted to do this and ended up actually implementing the law didn't just rely on these grants. They also needed 6 other separate strategies to implement their laws. Let's look to that supported from the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, September 2011, stating that, quote, issues that were necessary in passing a primary seatbelt law included, 1, understanding that passing a primary law is a multi-layer effort involving a broad-based network of organizations and individuals working in the unique political situation in the state. 2, identifying and effectively responding to opposition arguments. 3, maximizing awareness of the availability of incentive grants for seatbelt laws. 4, a portion of which using paid lobbyists to provide information and address concerns of legislators. 5, engaging the media to enlist and report on public support. 6, presenting the bill in terms of a public health issue to save lives. And 7, using a variety of legislative techniques, unquote. What you'll note there is that only one of those 7 strategies is actually using incentives to get the states to act. Meaning that even in the states that wanted this law, 7 strategies were necessary before they actually implemented reform. The impact of this point then is that states won't pass. States won't pass. Even the states that want to do this won't have the sufficient legislative clout to actually pass it. But let's move on specifically to solvency point number 3, which is hardcore offenders ignore. Hardcore offenders ignore. Specifically, hardcore offenders, which are the majority of people who don't use seatbelts, will likely ignore these laws even if we increase enforcement. My partner will support this with further evidence in his speech. Thank you so much for your time.
All right, fantastic speech. I got a couple questions for you.
Of course.
Can I have all the evidence that you read?
Sure. Here you go.
And do you mind if I pass that back to Jeffrey?
Go ahead.
Is the Highway Trust Fund a highway spending bill?
It's not a bill, it's a funding program that we have in the current system.
Sure. Is it your contention that no case that leverages the Highway Trust Fund is a topical case?
Well, it would depend on the things that you're leveraging. If you're leveraging a federal transportation reform, then that would be topical, but you're not. You're simply using something that would justify, you're using a standard, specifically incentivizing states with the Federal Highway Trust Fund, which is a standard that would justify literally any plan.
But for clarification, topicality when an affirmative team is leveraging the HTF is dependent on what they're leveraging the money for. That's what you said a second ago, correct?
Yes, and that part of that is specifically leveraging federal reform, not just state reform.
Okay. What material is your dream house constructed out of?
I've never thought of that. I guess it would be constructed out of hot dogs.
Okay. If you were building a hot dog house,
Sure.
would you need to buy hot dogs themselves?
Well, it depends if I was buying it from someone else or if I was
You'd have to
building the
buy the
house
hot dogs
myself.
though, right?
If I was building the house myself, then I would have to buy the hot dogs, yes.
Okay. Moving on down, I want to talk about your Sam Harper study a little bit. I promise that's relevant, guys. You would agree the Sam Harper study was analyzing data from 2000 to 2014, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And was that a study itself that you read, or was that a summary of the study that you read in your speech?
Sure, that was the specific conclusion of the study. We have the entire copy of the study if you would like to see it.
Sure, we have it as well. You would agree that seatbelts kill people, or don't kill people. Would you agree that seatbelts don't kill people?
I disagree.
Okay, so seatbelts actually do kill people.
In certain circumstances.
Okay. And would you say that seatbelts kill more people than they save?
Well, we'll have to wait for my partner's speech to get to that.
Ooh. I am waiting in anticipation. When did primary laws stop working?
When did primary laws stop working? Well, specifically what the study stated was that in the current system, they're not working. It doesn't matter what the specific date that they stopped working was. What matters is that once we account for all the trends currently ongoing with regards to road safety, traffic safety, etc., primary seatbelt laws, as per the result of the study, no longer have any effect.
And the piece of evidence you read about state incentives, you would agree that was offering states extra money to pass primary law?
Yeah, it's the same principle. If they don't implement the law, then they get X amount less money under your plan or under the past incentives. The same principle.
Does the media cover law change?
Sure, but specifically what my piece of evidence was talking about was that the federal government needed to enlist the media as active support, not just independent reporting.
Okay, and you would agree that the evidence that I read in my 1AC says that regardless of those 6 other factors you talked about in your evidence, seatbelt use will go up.
If we pass a primary enforcement law. But as I demonstrated, even the states that want those laws need those 6 other strategies and needed those 6 other strategies to overcome political opposition in the first place.
All right, I'm out of time. Thank you.
Safety 2018, quote, unbelted passengers can potentially kill other vehicle occupants on impact. Studies show that drivers and front seat passengers are at a 5 times greater risk of dying in a car crash if the rear passengers are not wearing seatbelts. The issue is that seatbelts aren't a personal choice. They affect other people, which is why all 50 states have within legal code a law that says you must wear your seatbelt. The issue is the enforcement of those laws. The majority of the states have secondary enforcement versus primary enforcement. What I want to specifically look at before we go and respond to the last speech is do a little bit of preemption talking more about the fact that seatbelts save lives. According to the NHTSA in 2006, they say, quote, the 2 percentage point increase in belt use from 2004 to 2005 prevented 540 fatalities, 8,000 serious injuries, and $1.8 billion in economic cost. Here's the deal. If you don't wear your seatbelt, you are more likely to die. Now, the negative team is more than welcome to bring up evidence that we've seen plenty of times that talks about how many people die in car crashes wearing seatbelts. The issue is that the seatbelt is not what killed them. In order for the negative team to disprove, as they alluded to in cross-examination, that seatbelts do not on net save lives, they must prove that in the number, which will probably be 40,000, that they will bring up in the next speech, that in those 40,000 cases, the people that were wearing the seatbelts would not have otherwise died. The abundant amount of evidence, which is why the 50 states have all passed seatbelt laws, proves that seatbelts save lives. We simply want to increase the enforcement to save more lives. Let's start off with their topicality press. Actually, before that, the stock issues, we agree to that burden, hence we'll respond to the topicality press. They argued this topicality press was not transportation reform because we were using a fiscal policy to incentivize a state transportation reform. We were not transportation on the federal level. I've got a couple of responses. My first response is fiscal. Yes, it could fit under a resolution that says the United States federal government could substantially reform its fiscal policy. Of course, the negative team's burden isn't just to prove another thing that our policy could fit under, but specifically that we are not federal transportation policy. The second response is inextricably linked to transportation. Inextricably linked to transportation. Here's the thing that my partner and I are not doing. Taking money from the general budget and offering it to states as an incentive for them to pass primary law. That would be a grant program, that would just be fiscal policy. What we're rather doing is not only just offering an additional grant, we're offering a condition on the existing grant, which means repealing part of the existing grant if states don't comply, and not just from any old grant program, not just from the general budget, but specifically from the Highway Trust Fund. This leads to the third response. Could be abused, but isn't. It could be abused, but isn't. The negative team is essentially arguing that you could do anything under the realm of highway transportation funding because just because you're using this funding bill doesn't necessarily make the policy transportation. Well, here's the problem with that argument. The reason that we're using the Highway Transportation or the Highway Trust Fund is specifically because all of the money set in the Highway Trust Fund is uniquely for transportation. We're not just using money that hasn't been allocated and we're just going to try to pass a state transportation policy with that money. Rather, what we're doing is specifically regarding federal transportation policy, reforming the Highway Trust Fund. The Highway Trust Fund is federal dollars specifically set apart for the building of highways. This leads to the fourth response. Condition on federal highway grants. Condition on federal highway grants. We agree that the transportation aspect of the states passing a seatbelt law isn't federal. So we're not going to claim that when the states pass their transportation law, that is a federal transportation policy. The federal transportation policy that we are passing is that the existing Highway Trust Fund now has a condition. In order for states to qualify for the money that is inextricably linked to use for highways only, called the Highway Trust Fund, they must also pass a transportation policy at the state level. So both at a federal and a state level, we're reforming transportation policy. The impact here was lost jurisdiction, that is the impact of topicality, but this topicality press is null. Now my partner brought up in cross-examination hot dogs, which means it's my burden to now finish the analogy. So with the hot dog analogy, yeah, thank you, Sam. The analogy of the hot dogs is actually very important because as my opponents agreed to, in order to build a hot dog house, you must first secure the hot dogs. You have to go and buy those hot dogs. Now what we're doing with our plan is in order to build roads, in order to facilitate transportation through interstates, what you have to have is the money to build those roads. Now of course the negative team could argue, well that means you could justify anything because just taking money and using that to buy hot dogs doesn't make it a hot dog or a construction project. If the money is specifically in a trust fund for the transportation, or in that case for the building of a hot dog house, and it cannot be delinked, then what you are doing is reforming that hot dog construction policy. I really hope Stoa never passes that resolution. Let's go ahead and look at their solvency point. Their solvency point was no impact in 2017. Their argument here was that even if this law has been effective in the past, it's not effective now. My first response is credibility failed. Credibility failed because we have 13 peer-reviewed studies by the CDC versus one Sam Harper study from McGill University in Canada in 2000. My second response is 13 versus 1. What we additionally have is 13 studies that conclusively say that, yes, when states upgrade from secondary to primary law, more lives are saved. But this leads to my third response, 726 lives. What's interesting about the Sam Harper study is that the Sam Harper study was one of the 13 studies the CDC evaluated. The reason the negative team is off in reading the summary of the study is because they are reading the summary of the study. Let's go to the actual study itself. According to Sam Harper, quote, after controlling for certain factors, the authors find that switching from secondary enforcement to primary enforcement has almost no impact on traffic death rates. States that upgrade their laws are estimated to have 0.22 fewer deaths per 100,000 than states that keep their secondary enforcement laws in place. Now, because the United States has a population of roughly 330 million, if you do the math, which you don't have to because we did it for you, that math comes out to about 726 lives. So at worst case scenario, even if the laws have waned in comparison to previous studies, as Sam Harper's rhetoric indicates, it doesn't matter. Because on a net beneficial scale, which the negative team agrees to, we still save 700 lives at bare minimum. Let's go ahead and look at their argument here about 48 states study. They read a second piece of evidence here saying that, well, in a separate study, we saw that there was no increase in seatbelt use. My response here is no decrease. No decrease. What we have in today's debate around our 13 studies saying that yes, when states upgrade from secondary to primary law, we see an increase in seatbelt use. The negative team has run at disadvantage saying actually when you ask people to buckle up, less of them do so. Rather what they said is one study was inconclusive and counteracts the credible 13 studies that the CDC peer reviewed. We disagree that that's actually evidence or relevant in today's debate on given the magnitude and also the impact of the other studies. The next solvency point they read was that we've failed in the past, specifically discussing in 2005 how we tried to incentivize states to pass primary seatbelt law, but that incentive failed. My first response is BAC. They completely ignored the analysis my partner brought in the 1AC, which said that in 2001, when we tried to incentivize states to pass a BAC law by withholding 2% of their highway trust funds, all 50 states complied. This went unrebutted. But the second response is lawn mowing. Lawn mowing, yes, hot dogs and lawn mowing in today's debate round. If my dad had told me this week he would pay me $500 to mow the lawn, today's Saturday, I should be mowing right now, I would have told him, no, I'm going to NITOC. I'd rather go to NITOC than earn that $500 as much as I need it. If my dad had told me, if you don't stay home and mow the lawn, I'm taking $500. As a high school student, I need to drive and I need that $500, I wouldn't be here at NITOC. There's a huge difference between an incentive grant and something that is a condition on receiving the existing grants that the states need. They finally concluded with talking about hardcore offenders already ignore this. My response here is empirically denied. And the reason it's empirically denied is because, as my partner read in the 1AC, 9% more people buckle in states with primary enforcement versus secondary enforcement. PBS confirms this when they say 92% of drivers use seatbelts in states with primary enforcement compared to 83% in states with secondary enforcement or none at all. Every solvency point of our case has been covered, and we clearly are topical. Thank you.
All right, excellent speech. Just a couple of questions about it. Starting off with just a general idea. Is your law specifically enforcing primary enforcement seatbelt laws for all vehicles on our roads today?
All passenger vehicles, yes.
Okay, let's specifically move on to topicality. Now, under this, you've stated that if we're withdrawing federal highway funds, then we are topical, essentially, correct?
We're specifically reforming the highway trust fund, yes.
Did you respond to the violation where I talked about how you're not actually reforming anything?
Yes, I did, by saying what we're reforming is a condition on existing funds.
Okay.
So in order to receive the same amount of funds, there's now a caveat.
All right. Is it your stance that if the federal government uses highway funds to incentivize states, essentially to ban something like building a hot dog house, is that transportation policy?
My response to this is that highway trust funds are inextricably linked to highway construction.
Okay.
Legally, they have to go to highways, hence making
So your stance is that anything that you incentivize with the federal highway trust fund is topical?
It is not.
Okay, and why is that?
Because the highway trust fund specifically, what we're using it for is transportation policy uniquely.
Okay.
You're making an argument that you could use the highway trust fund to reform hot dog stands when that's not legally possible.
Sure, thanks. That answers my question. So what you're saying is that the topicality of your mandate is contingent upon the topicality of the thing you are incentivizing.
No, the topicality of our mandate is topical because we aren't using the general budget. Yes, it's fiscal, but it's fiscal specifically in the highway transportation fund.
Let's move on. Let's move on specifically to Solvency 1. Here you talked about how supposedly this study found a 726 increase in lives.
Correct.
Now you specifically read a paragraph of that study.
That's correct.
Did you also read the sentence directly after that sentence?
I did not in this speech.
Okay.
You're more than welcome to read it in the next speech.
And what does that sentence actually say?
The sentence following this says, these estimates suggest that the impact of upgrading from secondary to primary enforcement death rates may have waned in comparison to earlier studies.
Okay, interesting. We'll definitely contest that. Let's move on specifically.
You'll contest that?
Yeah, specifically the intent of the evidence. to the first couple of responses you had to my Solvency 1. Here you talk about how you have a credible study and the 13 versus 1 study.
Correct.
Now, how many studies did this Sam Harper analysis take into account?
The Sam Harper analysis was a personal review of data conducted from 2000 to 2014.
So you're saying that he didn't rely on any other studies in his analysis?
He may have looked at other studies, but so did the CDC. That's not unique.
All right, interesting. Now, specifically, what were the dates of these studies that the CDC analyzed?
The dates on the CDC studies vary depending on the study.
And you would agree that the evidence I read for the study from Sam Harper specifically stated that earlier studies who failed to account for the variables that he did found a protective effect, but those studies were wrong because they weren't comprehensive.
I did hear that.
Okay, let's move on to Solvency 2. Here, in response to the incentives fail, you talked about the BAC law. You would agree that it's up to the states to implement this law, correct?
Sure.
And state opinions on different laws vary depending on the law.
Sure.
All right, so the most applicable precedent here is the specific incentives given to the states for seatbelt laws specifically, correct?
No, the most applicable example is last time we actually restricted funding, not offered additional funding, 2 different examples.
Interesting. Thank you so much for your time. You can actually see the evidence that you cited.
Sure. Sam Harper.
Enforcing an unjust law is itself unjust. That's going to be one of the issues that we evaluate later on in the speech as we get into some disadvantages with the affirmative team's case. But before we look at that, let's firstly look to several solvency issues within the affirmative team's plan. Solvency point number 1 is, or solvency point number 3 rather, building on the two solvency points raised by my partner, is of hardcore offenders. If we look at the words of Dr. David Shinar in 2017, quote, typically, once seatbelt use rates reach levels of 80 to 90%, the remaining hardcore non-users do not seem to be intimidated by tough laws and tough enforcement, unquote. That's evidence to support my partner's third solvency point, stating that once you reach use rates of seatbelts of 80 to 90%, you don't go any higher than that. And the average, even in states with no primary enforcement for seatbelt laws, is actually right now 87%, according to Dr. David Shinar again. Solvency point number 2 is how does the HTF compare? How does the HTF compare? Keep in mind that the affirmative team is saying that they can solve because back in the 2000s, we removed incentives, or we used incentives from the Highway Trust Fund to incentivize BAC limits while driving. Okay, so how much money did we remove back then? And how much money are we removing now? We need to see evidence from the affirmative team on this point. Otherwise, we don't know if they're actually going to be removing enough money to get the states to actually implement this policy. That's the huge solvency issue with the affirmative team's plan. They need to be able to prove that states are going to respond to these incentives. The only way that they've done that so far is to say that back in the 2000s, states did respond. To how much money? We don't know. Until we see that number, the affirmative team cannot prove solvency. Solvency point number 3 is of unreliable funding. Unreliable funding. According to Bob Williams, who's the president of State Budget Solutions, writing in 2015, quote, the HTF, the Highway Trust Fund, faces a cumulative shortfall of roughly $169 billion over the next 10 years. The federal government funds roughly a quarter of states' transportation needs, and the Highway Trust Fund is hopelessly in debt, unquote. So, let's just be clear about what the affirmative team is trying to do. They're trying to remove money from the states that we don't even really have in the first place. The Highway Trust Fund is already horribly in debt, so they are trying to incentivize the states to install these seatbelt laws with an unreliable source of funding. States aren't even going to ever be sure if they can get funding from the Highway Trust Fund because it's vastly in debt. And again, the affirmative team needs to be able to prove that states would accept these incentives and pass these seatbelt laws if they want to claim any solvency for their homes. With that stated, let's move on to solvency point number 5, building on the 3 solvency points for my partner and the 1 new solvency point in this speech. This is of states finding rules. States finding rules. In the past, the Highway Trust Fund has been used to incentivize a variety of policies. Not, notably, just transportation policies like the affirmative team claimed. My partner is going to be getting into that as a topicality response. But the Highway Trust Fund has been used before. And although states have grumbled and complained, they have passed policies. But they've always left loopholes. Subpoint A is of drinking age. Drinking age. Notably, first thing I want to point out here is the drinking age really topicality, or is really transportation policy. I should hope that most people would agree that it is not. Drinking age is not inherently linked to transportation. My partner is going to be arguing this in response to topicality. So, subpoint A, drinking age. Brian Resnick, writing for The Atlantic in 2014, quote, the Highway Trust Fund was used in 1984 to get states to comply with the new national drinking age of 21. All of the states eventually complied, unquote. Pretty optimistic picture, but the fact of the matter is, states left loopholes in that law. If we look at the United States Department of Transportation in December of 1999, quote, the Surgeon General of the United States determined in a series of reports in 1991 that many states' laws contain loopholes that still permit underage drinking. He lists, for instance, that some states do not prohibit minors from purchasing alcohol. Some states allow minors to possess alcohol under certain conditions. Many states do not specifically prohibit consumption by minors. So if the states don't want the law that they're incentivized to put in place, then they can install loopholes. More evidence of this is actually can be seen if we look to speed limits. The federal government also tried to incentivize speed limits. So this is subpoint B, speed limits. According to Stephen Moore, writing for Cato Institute in 1999, quote, in March of 1974, Congress enacted the maximum speed limit that established a national 55 mile per hour speed limit. Congress strictly enforced the law by withholding federal highway money to states that were in non-compliance. But in the mid-1980s, Arizona, Maryland, New Hampshire, Vermont, and Wyoming were all found in non-compliance and received a warning from the Department of Transportation, unquote. So essentially, several of the states didn't even bother complying with the law. They had complied in name so that they could keep their funding, but they didn't enforce the law. Our police officers didn't actually make sure that people obeyed the speed limit. And it wasn't until the federal government went back and checked that there was compliance to its original mandate that it found out that any states were not in compliance. Does the affirmative team mandate that in a few years we go back and check if states are complying with this incentive? Does the affirmative team mandate that we check that states are obeying these incentives? No. So, let's move on to sub B, actually, which is of no fine specifications. No fine specifications. The affirmative team leaves it completely open to the states to charge however much they want in terms of penalties. States could literally give 999 warnings and then charge a fine of 2 cents for speeding or for seatbelt violations. There is no specifics from the affirmative team that states would actually charge an effective deterrent as a fine. Keep in mind, too, that if states don't want these laws, which the affirmative team agreed that the states that only have secondary enforcement right now do not want primary enforcement laws. If the states don't want primary enforcement law, they are under no obligation to enforce it strongly. This is actually empirically borne out with the speed limit law. Montana didn't want the law, and so it implemented a fine of $5. According to Timothy Egan, who's a journalist writing for the New York Times in 1989, quote, Montana highways never had a daytime speed limit until the federal government ordered all states to post one of 55 miles per hour. Only after federal officials threatened to withhold highway funds did the state enact a $5 speeding ticket. If there is no effective deterrent fine, there is no effectiveness of the affirmative team's policy. With that stated, let's move into the disadvantages with the affirmative team's fine. Disadvantage 1 is of unjust law. Unjust law. Subpoint A is of shouldn't enforce injustice. Shouldn't enforce injustice. Like with the Escaped Slave Act, we shouldn't enforce a law that is unjust. Subpoint B is lives endangered. Lives endangered. According to Peake and Fowler, a law firm in 2016, 40,000 people die from preventable auto defects due to seatbelts, just like the affirmative team predicted that we would bring up. They also stated that we wouldn't necessarily be able to link this number to people dying because of the seatbelts. Well, so let's actually look to the words of the Seatbelt Automotive news source writing in 2002, when it lists, for instance, Sean Barber, who was trapped by his seatbelt when he went into a river, Jason O'Connor, who had the same problem, Karen Anderson, Terrence Hudson, Carlos McKenna. People can die because of seatbelts, and subpoint C, therefore, is of no federal right. No federal right. In the words of William J. Hodorf, the state has no authority to subject people to death and injury in certain kinds of traffic accidents, just in the hopes that other people will be saved in other accidents. Because of this, I would urge a vote for the negative. Thank you very much.
Has the Supreme Court ruled seatbelt laws unconstitutional?
I don't believe the Supreme Court has ruled seatbelt laws unconstitutional. That's not the basis of my argument. I'm not arguing this on a constitutional basis. I'm arguing this on a basis of justice.
You argue that the BAC law is outdated, correct?
I don't believe I stated that now. I stated that we don't know how the current Highway Trust Fund compares with the amount of money in the Highway Trust Fund back then.
Are states dependent on the Highway Trust Fund for money?
Not generally.
Can states build all of their highway systems without Highway Trust Fund money?
We haven't seen any evidence from the affirmative team that they can.
Would you agree that you just read evidence that 25% of the money for highways comes from the Federal Highway Trust Fund?
That's correct. 25% is definitely not a majority of the money, and there's no evidence that the states desperately need this 25%, or if they're just spending it on sidewalks.
Do states receive millions of dollars from the Highway Trust Fund annually?
We've seen no evidence from the affirmative team concerning that.
Does about $44 billion exist in the Highway Trust Fund?
About $44 billion exists in the Highway Trust Fund. Not all of that is given to states. Some of it is used for federal construction projects. We've seen no evidence from the affirmative team how much of that $44 billion is actually given to states.
Did the federal requirement back in 2001 require states to pass a BAC law of 0.08?
I believe it did, yes.
Did all states comply?
All states did comply. That is not to say that the law was actually enforced effectively or that the states did not find loopholes.
In the 1970s, when the United States government asked states to pass a 21-year-old drinking age, did the law say they asked them to pass a 21-year-old purchasing age or drinking age?
Drinking age specifically, and the states, because they did not want the law, got around that by still allowing minors to purchase alcohol and possess alcohol.
Is that what your evidence said?
I believe so, yes. If you'd like to see that evidence, we can certainly hand that to you.
All right. With both the 21-year-old drinking age and the 0.08, and also the example of speed limits, you would agree that each time the federal government has leveraged the Highway Trust Fund, states have complied?
States have complied in name. They have not complied in the spirit.
There's been loopholes.
Yeah, there's been loopholes and lax enforcement.
What loopholes could be exploited from our case?
I talked about what? The fines. We don't know what punishment needs to be installed. These laws are only going to be effective if they actually deter people from riding without a seatbelt.
On that note, when has a state ever implemented a 2-cent fine?
I don't know.
Would you agree that 14 of the 18 states that have primary seatbelt law have a $10 or less fine?
If we see evidence for that, then yeah, sure, we could agree.
Would you agree when you get a speeding citation, your insurance premiums increase?
In specific instances, sure. In Montana specifically, it's actually not allowed that a violation of the speed limit go on your record.
Would you agree with the fact that in the examples you talked about when someone is trapped underwater, that if they were unconscious, they would die underwater?
Yes. Now, as much as the affirmative team is trying to rely on historical precedents to demonstrate the solvency of their plan, the problem is that there are 4 variables that are different in this case, which means that states will not respond to these incentives. Let's look at first in an observation, which is simply historical precedent is irrelevant. Historical precedent is irrelevant. Now, of course, this isn't always true, but in this specific case, states that have obeyed federal incentives in the past were different for numerous reasons. Subpoint A here is that they wanted to spend the money on specifically seatbelt education, etc., etc. They wanted to have these seatbelt laws in the past. Those are the only states that implemented them. The ones who currently don't have seatbelt laws don't want that, which means they have no incentive to enforce this. But subpoint B here is that they wanted to enforce the laws. The states that passed these laws wanted to enforce the laws. Those which currently don't have these laws, well, they don't want to enforce them because they haven't passed the laws. Subpoint C here is of wanted to institute fines. Wanted to institute fines. The states that did actually want to enforce this wanted to institute fines because they wanted effective enforcement. But current states don't want that because they haven't passed the laws. Subpoint D here is simply of didn't try to find loopholes. Didn't try to find loopholes. The states that wanted this law obviously weren't going to try to find loopholes because they wanted the law. That's it. Let's move on to specifically responding to their arguments in the 2AC. Starting off with this 2% increase, or 2% increased use of seatbelts means 540 lives saved. My response here is of no longer increases compliance. No longer increases compliance. Sure, maybe this is true in some cases, but let's keep in mind that primary seatbelt laws specifically don't any longer enforce compliance. We'll get to that a bit later on. Let's move on to the issue of topicality. I'm just going to group all of their responses under one main response, which is simply of a flawed standard. Flawed standard. Keep in mind what they're using to justify their policy is that they are making a change specifically to the Federal Highway Trust Fund. Subpoint A here, though, is renders the resolution meaningless. Renders the resolution meaningless. If we can make any change to the Federal Highway Trust Fund and claim that it is under the resolution loses all its meaning because we can incentivize literally anything, even banning hot dog houses. Subpoint B under here, though, is specifically not incentivizing transportation program. Not incentivizing transportation program. Now they're claiming that, well, we're incentivizing a transportation program because of seatbelts, thus we're enforcing something that is transportation. This isn't true, though. Seatbelts are classified under a completely different policy type by the government, specifically law enforcement policy. Now, of course, they have to demonstrate that seatbelts, or what they're enforcing, would be related to transportation in some way, but they've not actually brought up any definitions. You see, whether or not a seatbelt law is enforced doesn't change the means of conveyance or transportation in the United States. seatbelt laws have no relevance to transportation. Thus, they're doing essentially the same thing as banning on hot dog caps once again, something completely outside of the resolution. That said, though, let's specifically move on to responding to their arguments in response to our Solvency 1. Here they talk about how they have a credible study, how it examined 13 studies, and how our study actually showed a saving of 720 lives. I found this somewhat ironic, because Jeffrey was saying, well, we're only citing a summary of a study, and then he proceeds to do exactly the same thing. He's citing a summary of the study and not the actual study itself. Let's look to the actual study. They were citing this place where it says when we have primary enforcement, we are estimated to have 0.22 fewer deaths per 100,000 of the population than states that did not have upgrades. And he ignores the sentence right after that where it says rigorous difference in difference models estimated separately for each age group were homogeneous and showed no impact of upgrading to primary enforcement. In other words, when the study then applied more rigorous methodology, the sentence literally right after they're reading this estimate, it found absolutely no impact of upgrading to a primary seatbelt law on seatbelt use. What does this mean? Well, the affirmative team solves absolutely nothing. Because even if we increase to primary enforcement, well, we're not actually increasing the number of people who use seatbelts. My second response here, though, 34 studies taken into account. 34 studies taken into account. If we want to go by the magnitude of studies that support this, well, the Sam Harper study took into account 34 studies and found no impact, word for word, of seatbelt laws. What this means is, once again, if we want to go by the magnitude of studies, the only conclusion is that seatbelt laws, specifically primary enforcement seatbelt laws, don't increase compliance. Let's move on, though, specifically to my third response here, which is of within margin of error. Within margin of error. Even this part of the study that they're citing is admitted to be within the margin of error or within the confidence interval specifically of the study, which means that it's not even certain that these 0.22 are saved per 100,000 of the population. Let's move on, though, to the next argument. Here they talk about the BAC law and lawn mowing. My response here is simple. Different law, different state opinion. Different law, different state opinion. We can't look to a different law because states are going to have different opinions on different laws, which means that, sure, maybe they wanted to enforce the BAC law, but what matters is that empirically they don't want to enforce the seatbelt law because they haven't implemented primary enforcement laws. Finally, the thing I want to pull through is that we need even the states that wanted this, needed 7 strategies to actually implement this law. This was never responded to in the last speech, meaning that they concede the fact that, well, if we don't have these 7 strategies, well, we can't actually solve anything. Thank you so much for your time.
Let's clear up this issue about whether or not states need HTF money. I've got the graph right here. Rhode Island gets 263,000, South Carolina gets 742,000, Indiana gets 1.1 million, California's taken up a heck of a ton with 4 million. States need federal money. I want to move on down to the other arguments that the negative team presented in their speech. Starting off with the solvency about hardcore offenders, they say there's some people that no matter what you do won't wear their seatbelts. That's denied by the University of Minnesota in 2014 in an argument you can tag as non-supporters comply. It says, quote, findings show that support increased from 62% just before the law was passed to more than 70% in 2013, while the percentage of Minnesotans buckling up was at an all-time high of nearly 95%. This shows that some people are wearing their seatbelts even though they don't support the law, end quote. The study from the University of Minnesota denies this assumption because non-supporters do in fact comply with the law. Solvency 4 was HTF comparison. Basically, the idea was that it's not going to work this time just because it worked with BAC. My first response is 100% success rate. They haven't actually addressed the BAC example, they just said it was 18 years ago, but the problem is that's the most recent time we leveraged the Highway Trust Fund. If we're going for recency and relevance, the BAC example is about as recent and relevant as it gets, but my second response is burden of assertion. Burden of assertion. The status quo is BAC because that's the last time we leveraged the HTF. The negative team now has to give you evidence for why doing it again won't work. They can't put the burden on us and say that we have to prove simply because it's a couple years down the line that it's going to work again, when the most recent example worked with a 100% success rate. It's their burden of assertion to show it won't work this time. The next thing they talked about was how we don't have reliable funding, because the HTF sometimes loses money or is essentially bankrupt. My response is 34 test cases. PBS in 2015 says, quote, since 2005, Congress has passed 34 short-term extensions, and it has not reauthorized the fund for more than 2 years at a time. This is standard operating policy for Congress. They patch the HTF, it almost goes bankrupt, they patch it again, on and on and on and on. This has happened 34 times. Neg needs to show you why the 35th time is uniquely different. Solvency Point 6 was about how state fines and drinking age and speed limits, all of those have loopholes. My first response is loopholes irrelevant. Loopholes irrelevant. The fact that there's loopholes doesn't impact the effect that more people are going to wear seatbelts, more people are going to drive under the speed limit, more people are going to drink under, follow the drinking age, but my second response is 100% won't wear. Jeffrey and I have never contended that every single person under our policy is going to buckle up. That's not what we're saying. What we are saying is that more people are going to buckle up. up. That leads to my third response of net benefits. Under our policy, more people buckle up and more lives are saved. But my fourth response is a false burden. A false burden. The negative team is making it sound like we have to prove to you that speed limits and the national drinking age were effective policies. We don't. All we have to prove to you is that the funding that was used to get those policies passed was effective funding. Then we stop. Now we talk about whether or not primary seatbelt law is effective, because that's the case that we're passing in today's debate round. It's a false burden for them to ask us to prove things like speed limits worked. But they did work, because the evidence that they brought up about speed limits says that 45 states fully complied with the law. Jean-Luc, or was it Mattis? I don't know, I'm sorry. brought up in his last speech that it was the 5 outlying states that didn't comply. The final thing that was talked about was the disadvantage of unjust lives, the 40,000 number that we thought they were going to bring up. My first response is the weight of evidence. The weight of evidence. Specifically, what we've talked about was from the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, and that's the piece of evidence I'm going to read now in my second response. Always a better chance. Always a better chance. According to the NHTSA, quote, seatbelts can trap you in a fire or underwater. Myth or real? Myth. Incidents involving fire or water account for 0.5% of all crashes. But more importantly, you can't escape such dangers unless you're conscious. Wearing a seatbelt gives you a much greater chance of being conscious and able-bodied. Even in the ridiculously minute example that the negative team brings up of where you get trapped underwater, the NHTSA, the most credible source on this issue, says you have the best chance to stay alive if you're wearing your seatbelt. Let's move on to the next speech, where they specifically talked about topicality. My first response is that they dropped Jeffrey's response 3 and response 4, which are the responses that very directly refuted the topicality argument they made in their last speech, so I'm going to reiterate those responses. My first response to topicality is could be abused but isn't. Could be abused but isn't. The negative team agreed that while this standard could be abused, what we're specifically reforming is money that has to be spent on highways, and that's my second response. Condition on federal grants. This money has to be spent on highways, just like you have to buy hot dogs to build a hot dog house. At the end of the day, because this money must be spent on a transportation issue, it is transportation policy. We agree the states are passing one as well if they want to include that. The next thing they talked about was Sam Harper and brought up the 34 studies. My response is equivocation. Equivocation. What I mean by that is the sentence that they read. States that have upgraded to primary enforcement are estimated to have the 0.22. Then they read, difference in difference models estimated separately for each age group were homogeneous and also showed. Why does the word also showed matter? Because it's reflecting on the earlier statistic. It's saying we agree with this earlier statistic. The problem is the earlier statistic didn't say there was no effect. It said we saved 726 lives a year. In response to different states' different opinions and the 7 other strategies, my response is sure, these 7 other strategies might increase use more, but we increase use, we save lives, we're topical, and we uphold net benefits both after a shiny new counter plan.
Just joking, obviously. So, let's start off with the voting issues. 6 voting issues in this speech. Voting issue number 1 is of topicality. Topicality. The point I want to make under this is that states use the money. States are the ones who use the money. Maybe this money is going to highways. Federal highways? Nope. Only state highways. The resolution asks for a reform of federal transportation policy, not state highways. Under that standard, that this money must be going to reform federal transportation, the affirmative team is not tolerant. Voting issue 2 is that danger is a choice. Danger is a choice. Their only real response to my disadvantage in the last speech is that on net, you're safer. Let me return to that evidence from William J. Hodorf, with which I closed my 2NC. In 2002, the state has no authority to subject people to death and injury in certain kinds of traffic accidents just because it hopes others will be saved in other kinds of accidents, unquote. It doesn't matter if on net you're safer. The government in no situation can mandate that you do something dangerous. Even if on net you're safer, danger always has to be a choice, not something that's forced. Even if on net you're safer. So, the impact of this is of violating American values. Violating American values. Living in this nation, we are under the implicit agreement with our government that we are going to not be forced to do something that's dangerous for us. Again, yes, seatbelts do save lives in certain instances if you can actually get people to wear them. But because seatbelts are dangerous in other instances, the federal government cannot mandate their use. Voting issue 3 is no AF study is relevant. No AF study is relevant. And keep in mind the question I asked in the first cross-examination. Did their studies rely on empirical data from states that wanted to pass primary enforcement? Yes. All of their studies rely on states that wanted to pass primary enforcement laws. States that wanted to implement those 7 strategies my partner talked about. States that wanted to enforce those laws strongly. States that wanted to actually implement a worthwhile fine. But the remaining states don't want to implement primary enforcement. They turned down the incentive grants that the federal government offered them in the past. And so we can't use studies from states that did implement all the necessary strategies to encourage use and to save lives to prove that the states that don't want to implement all of those strategies would have the same impacts. Voting issue 4 is weight of evidence. Weight of evidence. Specifically evaluating the 34 studies that Sam Harper talked about. My response to the idea that this is unequivocal, that this is looking at a different type of methodology, basically, is of confidence interval. Confidence interval. The confidence interval evaluated by Sam Harper actually, basically, the margin of error of the study included, basically, a scenario in which seatbelts actually hurt people, or a scenario in which seatbelts had no effect. So, the margin of error of the study included the number that the affirmative team talked about. That is not statistical evidence that that number is true, because if a number falls within a study's margin of error, then that means that the study's authors have not been able to determine whether or not that factor was due to chance or due to the factor that they were evaluating. That is how statistical analysis works. You have a certain margin of error. If the result is extreme enough that it falls outside of the margin of error, then you know that seatbelt laws are what's causing the result. If it's within the margin of error, then you don't know whether or not it was seatbelt laws or chance that caused the result, which is why Sam Harper ultimately concluded, based off his evaluation of 34 studies, that seatbelt laws don't save lives. Voting issue 5 is 7 strategies. 7 strategies. In their last speech, Sam's only response to this was that, well, even if we implement only some of these strategies, we'll still save lives. That's not what my partner's evidence was talking about. My partner's evidence was talking about 7 strategies that needed to be implemented before we could pass the law, not 7 strategies that were passed after we passed the law. If the laws aren't even implemented, if these 7 strategies aren't implemented by states that don't want to implement them, then we're never going to see the laws in the first place. And finally, voting issue 6 is that states don't want it. The only real response to this was that it's a false burden that we have to prove that former laws worked. No, it isn't. If former laws didn't work, then how are they going to get their law to work this time? This is not at all a false burden, so I would urge a vote for the negative team. Thank you so much for your time.
I want to begin by responding to the voting issues with the negative speaker just brought up with our own voting issues. Voting issue number 1 is topicality. It's a big issue in today's debate round. Subpoint A is condition on road grants. Condition on road grants. Go back to my speech where we brought up, it may be a fiscal policy, but we're not utilizing the general budget. We're specifically utilizing the Highway Trust Fund, meaning that the highway aspect and the federal aspect are inextricably linked. Subpoint B, not condition on hot dog grants. Not a condition on hot dog. I think this is self-evident, but it's not a condition on hot dog grants. The importance of this argument is that while there may be the potential to abuse a fiscal policy, we aren't abusing it because we're specifically using this for a transportation policy. It's a transportation policy because it's the Highway Trust Fund uniquely. Subpoint C is classification irrelevant. They can't say, well, within the federal government, the seatbelts aren't quantified as an actual transportation policy because the Highway Trust Fund is. The classification of those seatbelts under the state policies doesn't matter. What we're specifically passing is a federal transportation policy. This analysis has been unrebutted. The second voting issue is states comply. Under this issue of solvency, the negative team wonders whether or not the states will actually pass a seatbelt law. Subpoint A is BAC. They all passed the BAC law. Now, of course, the negative team then made a second solvency point talking about whether or not this law worked. We'll address that in a second. But the subpoint B is $4 billion annually. $4 billion annually. Now, when Sam brought up in the last speech and said, look at all these states. This state receives $200,000. This state receives $178,000. I watch you guys shake your heads and go, I'm pretty sure they can increase their taxes. That's completely non-unique. That's not very much money. We handed the sheet of paper to the negative speaker. There are actually more zeros on the end than Sam read. The $4 million he cited for California is $4 billion. Every one of those numbers, he missed the extra 3 zeros on the end. The negative team has that evidence just to cooperate it's fair in today's debate round. So the states comply. States rely on millions of dollars, specifically as the negative team admitted, about 25% of their money for highways comes from the federal government. They're absolutely dependent. We believe because they're dependent on this, they will pass a law. Now we have to look at whether the law will work. Subpoint 3, or actually voting issue 3, is people comply. We believe people will comply with this law. Subpoint A is fines irrelevant. As I cited in the last speech, A lot of the states that already have seatbelt laws have low fines. That doesn't matter. Subpoint B is insurance, hassle, and embarrassment. Insurance, hassle, and embarrassment. The unique incentive of getting pulled over isn't whether you have to pay extra $5. It's about the insurance, which their only response to is, well, one state doesn't require your insurance to go up. The two, it's the hassle of getting pulled over, and three, it's the embarrassment of telling your mother. We believe people typically don't want to get pulled over. Subpoint C is non-supporters comply. The negative team never responded to our analysis about regardless of whether people like the law, they still comply with it. Subpoint D is 2 to 15%. 2 to 15%. Whether you take the NHTSA study I read, or whether you take Sam's analysis that the 5 most recent states have seen a 12 to 15% increase in seatbelt use. Each of the states that have passed the seatbelt law have seen an increase in use. The negative team argues, well, what if there's a loophole? Our law doesn't allow loopholes like the BAC did. I asked in cross-examination, what would an example of a loophole look like? The only reason they can give you that states will find a loophole is with the fines. There's not some other way out of it. If you upgrade from secondary to primary, that means police have power. The only other argument for solvency is if they're going to contend all the police officers form a union against the states and don't enforce the law. We don't think that's what they're saying. They're arguing that there's some loophole. But the only loophole is the fines, which isn't a loophole because most states have low fines anyway, and empirically, there's a 9% increase in seatbelt use. The negative team concedes the fact that when people wear seatbelts, more of them are, actually, they don't concede this. We'll get to this in a second. The first voting issue they brought up is topicality. We responded to that in my voting issue. The second thing they brought up is the danger equals a choice. On net, people are safer. My response here is always safer. Our analysis specifically said that you are always safer because even in the rare instance they brought up, you will die if you are unconscious. Seatbelts make you conscious. Subpoint B is their second response, public justification. They never responded to my first piece of evidence in my last speech where I talked about you put other people at a 5 times greater risk if you're not wearing a seatbelt. It's not just a personal choice because it affects others. The third response is unnecessary debate. I talked earlier about all 50 states have seatbelt laws. If they think those shouldn't exist, they can run a counterplan to repeal them or something, but the specific argument is it doesn't matter whether they believe seatbelt laws are immoral, they already exist, we're simply enforcing them. Then they talked about the third voting issue of no affirmative study, and the study was irrelevant. My response here is BAC opposition. There was opposition to the BAC law, it got passed, and it got enforced. They never responded to this. Their fourth voting issue was talking about the weight of evidence. My response here is wrong. Their analysis about how the .22 was within the margin of error, they never read you a sentence that said this was within the margin of error. The importance of this is specifically, one sentence says there was no net increase, one sentence says there was a .22 increase, they claim the .22 is the way out, extra outlier, we claim the .0 is the outlier. No one really wins this effect is nullified, so you can look at the evidence if you want, but there's really nowhere to go with this evidence. The fifth voting issue is 7 strategies. My response is how to pass a law. Yeah, they read 7 things. You have to respond to they respond to the governor, you have to make sure that there are not people opposing the law, you have to pass it, you have to have incentives, etc. Those don't matter, because in the states that passed BAC law, those things all got responded to. The final thing is prove the former worked. My response here is speed limits and BAC. Each of these cases, all the states passed it. 45 of the states actually did see their decrease in speed limits, and all the states have a .28 BAC to this day. Thank you.